Okay. Welcome to the penultimate session of the PGWiP for this term. It's been a good program so far. Today we are delighted to welcome Martina Astrid Rodda. Martina completed a bachelor's at the University of Bedford, followed by a master's, and is now completing a DPhil at Jesus College, Oxford. And Martina is going to present some of their research to us now. So please, Martina, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
Here we go. Just in a second. Slideshow, I guess.
That's right.
Yes, I am not a Mac user. Is this? Yes.
Shall we do? Because they will see this. Yep.
Okay, lovely. So thank you. So today's talk fits in the general context of my DPhil, which is about formulaic variation and linguistic productivity in archaic Greek epic. And actually, I'm going to present to you basically all the results I have thus far. So I particularly appreciate hearing what people with a more literary mindset think about this. So today's paper will be in 3 parts, more or less. So I'll do a short, quick introduction with some theory, and then I'll present 2 case studies. One is about syntax, and the other is about semantics, and the second one is much more of a work in progress. So the dichotomy between oral and written poetry has been formulated in terms of oral traditional style on one side and literate or literary individual expression on the other, with literary style tending towards deliberate variation of formulaic patterns, while traditional style is described as based on natural repetition. And of course, the question is, to what extent is this true? And also, what does natural mean anyway, both in linguistic terms and when it comes specifically to Greek epic? So if we want to look at formulaic variation, which is what I want to do, we need to be able to define and describe formulae as flexible structures. And we want a definition that will maintain the unity of a formula as a thing that we're looking at, but that it will also recognize that while some formulae in the nominative tend to be rigidly fixed, the most inflected formulae are not, and that name epithet formulae, so Paris' initial example, are much less flexible than, for instance, noun adjective formulae. And then we want to look at the flexibility of the formula, but we also want to acknowledge that it is still limited, and we want to be able to map its limits, ideally. So the most basic and most traditional idea of the formula is Milman Paris, and I'm going to quote it for sort of general background. Formulae are repeated meaningful units, and formulaic diction changes as an effect of changes in the spoken language. And along these lines, between the 60s and the 80s, there have been a series of studies of morphological change in epic formulae, which have a strong focus on diachrony. The idea is that external change happens independently of the formulaic language and then influences it. And so external change can be used to date the text as new forms become available through time. And the key idea here is that language change in epic proceeds in a completely different way from natural language. But is this a viable assumption, and doesn't it conflict with the notion that is equally strong in the Parian tradition that formulaic usage in an oral tradition should be treated as natural? A completely different take from a theoretical standpoint is that of John Brian Hainsworth, who works on adjective noun formulae, and his take is that formulaic modification is a consequence of the performance context. So when a singer wants to use a formula, they will naturally think of it in its primary shape, but they will change it if the primary shape does not fit the line anymore. So for instance, if the position where the formula would normally occur is already occupied. And this leads to the creation of transient secondary expressions, I am quoting, which are employed as a response to an emergency in composition. So for instance, a singer will naturally have in mind the line end formula polei acre, but if the line end position is already occupied, then they will use polei acrotate, which fits before the caesura. And the main upshot of this is that rather than being seen as a sign of incompetence or of the generation of the epic tradition, the increase of formulaic modification in texts that are later than Homer is viewed as a sign of poetic skill, and it's also viewed as a phenomenon that is internal to Homer and not just diachronic. Of course, as we were saying at the beginning, we need a definition of the formula that can accommodate variation before we try to describe it. And Ainsworth's solution to this relies on the mutual expectancy, his words, between the components of the formula. So the use of a word creates the expectation that the other will follow if you have a two-word formula. And this definition is especially good because it can accommodate common patterns of variation, inflection, metrical change, whatever you want. But it can also accommodate changes in word order and in separation, because the connection between the words that make up a formula does not rely on adjacency or a predefined order. So you can consider expanded formulae together with the non-expanded version, and so on. So for instance, fainu douros, which is fairly rare in Homer, can be considered together with dori faeno, which is a very frequent formula. And this is intuitively true, but Ainsworth's definition allows us to formalize it, and not just that, as we will see in a moment. So we have modification is determined by usage. So we have a concept of formulaic variation that can be compared more naturally to natural linguistic productivity, in which linguistic structures are also adapted based on contextual pressure in everyday language production. We have a definition of the formula that relies on the connection between the words that make up the formula. And with these traits in mind, we can move on to the question of, just how flexible these flexible formulae are, and see where the definition that we have just laid out can take us in terms of setting up a quantitative analysis of formulaic flexibility. And we do that through a short detour into contemporary linguistics. So Ainsworth's definition of the formula presents parallels with the behavior of so-called bound expressions in ordinary language. And these are expressions that range from collocations, so, foregone conclusion, the sort of thing, the sort of two words you always say together, to idioms, proper, so, kick the bucket, lay down the law, whatever you want. And the characteristics of bound expressions are their non-random co-occurrence patterns, so the words making them up occur together with a frequency that is significantly above chance. And this sounds kind of like Ainsworth's definition of the bond of mutual expectancy, only instead of being psychological, instead of being based in the expectations of the audience or the singer, it's externalized. So in a usage-based perspective, we can also say that the fact that these expressions occur together more often than chance in the linguistic material we're exposed to also creates the linguistic expectation that Ainsworth was referring to. Bound expressions also show limited syntactic flexibility to a different extent. This is very clear in the case of idioms. Kick the bucket is always like that. You can say the bucket has been kicked. But it also happens in bound expressions that are not idiomatic. So you can't say this conclusion is not foregone, or so native speakers tell me. I make no claims about any judgment about English. If you Google it, you get a handful of hits. So it's like basically ungrammatical. So if we define a class of bound expressions based on their behavior instead of some theoretical characteristic, this gives us the advantage of having a quantifiable definition, so something that we can measure quantitatively. And this is particularly good for corpus studies, where you have all the material available, but what you don't have is the native speakers. So you can't rely on intuition on any kind. On the other hand, quantifiable phenomena have the bad habit of not falling into neat black and white categories. They tend to present along a continuum of most to least prototypical. And so, for instance, for the bond of mutual expectancy, foregone conclusion, nothing but conclusions is ever foregone. While if you get agree wholeheartedly, I can see you trying to find examples. I am making claims sort of as a general, broad. So, with agree wholeheartedly, you can do other things wholeheartedly that are not agreeing. So the expectancy is not quite 100%, but it's still above chance. And you find the same thing in Homer. You have formulae like neidumos hypnos, where only hypnos is ever neidumos. You find adjectives that go with a couple of nouns, but otherwise do not occur. And you find adjectives like melas, black, that just occurs with a very large class of nouns in Homer, and all of these are, to an extent, formulaic. So there are parallels. What do we do with them? So can we leverage these parallels to set up a model for a quantitative account of formulaic variation? And I do this, the answer is yes, of course. Otherwise, I wouldn't be asking the question. But I start from a study of English idioms by Stephanie Wolfe, Wolf compares the rates of variation in a set of verb, noun, phrase idioms. So take the plunge, make a point, verb plus an object, to the rates of variation in non-idiomatic verb, noun, phrase pairs that she takes as a baseline. And the main point here is that what matters is not how frequent a specific type of variation is, but how the frequency in idioms compares to the frequency in the baseline. Because some types of variation are just less frequent than others. If you compare things like tense variation to things like a passive imperative, which I have built like for your pleasure here, it's quite obvious that passive imperatives in English are generally quite rare. So the fact that they are rare in idioms is not particularly interesting. What is interesting is whether some types of variation are more or less frequent in idioms than they are in a baseline set of phrases. So in short, this study gives us the theoretical background, a set of measures, and a statistical method to assess syntactic flexibility in not idioms this time, but formulae compared to non-formulaic usage. So I gather some quick preliminary results by redoing Ainsworth's study of adjective noun formulae of a specific metrical shape. This is sometimes people neglect to mention this, but Ainsworth does not look at all adjective noun formulae, only those of those two specific shapes. And I have grouped the different types of variation in specific syntactic classes. So I'm not just looking at expansion, for instance, under Ainsworth's definition, but I'm looking at expansion by the addition of an adjective versus a noun versus the article versus a preposition, and so on. And the results of this study show that more frequent formulae tend to be significantly more flexible. So frequent repetition does not lead to higher entrenchment of one fixed form, but on the contrary, it exposes the formula to more occasions for change. And this is broadly comparable to something that, for instance, in phonology is called the reduction effect. So sound changes are promoted by the token frequency of words, because words that are pronounced more often will go through sound changes more often. However, some specific phenomena seem to depend on the semantics of the expression involved. So for instance, phrases with allos tend to attract the definite article for semantic reasons, because if you are using other, you sometimes need to differentiate between another and the other in a pair of two, and you start using the article for that in Homer. I've given you a couple of references about this, but this is fairly widely accepted. So, on the basis of these preliminary results, we moved on to a more fine-grained analysis of the behavior of adjective noun formulae. And I use the Diorisis online corpus for this analysis. This is a corpus that contains all of the Perseus texts, plus a couple more. And it's fully lemmatized and part-of-speech tagged. So each word is associated with its dictionary lemma, and also a morphological analysis and the part of speech that it belongs to. Is it an adjective, a noun, a verb, and so on. I divided the corpus into two subcorpora, or rather I extracted two subcorpora from the corpus. One is my target corpus, archaic epic, so the Iliad and the Odyssey, Hesiod, Theogony and Works and Days, and the four major Homeric hymns, so Demeter, Apollo, Hermes, and Aphrodite. And then my baseline corpus for comparison is made of all the texts that are tagged with a 5th century date in Diorisis, so a decision that is independent from me. Of course, we have no synchronic option available for comparison, which is a pain when you work on Homer. 5th century is the earliest date when we have a sizable amount of texts from a relatively synchronic moment, and they're also dialectally not entirely uniform, which is what we want if we're looking at Homer. I extracted my adjective noun / noun adjective pairs. I'm going to keep saying adjective noun, but order is not important unless I mention it. By a Python script automatically. Thanks, Alessandro Achille, for writing the Python script. The script extracts all pairs within a window of 6 words, inclusive, and I've only considered pairs that occur at least 20 times in each corpus. So I have a frequency threshold. And the precision of the script, so the proportion of pairs that are actually adjective noun pairs and not false positives, is around 98%, so great. The recall, which means the proportion of pairs compared to the actual number of pairs in the corpus, the proportion of pairs that the script retrieves compared to the actual number of the pairs in the corpus. So how many false negatives do we get if we reverse this measure? It's difficult to assess because we don't actually know how many adjective-noun pairs are in either of our corpora. We can look at Hainsworth, but Hainsworth doesn't have a 100% recall rate because he only looks at formulae of a specific metrical shape. And even for formulae that he considers, actually the script retrieves more hits. So he missed a few, which is entirely understandable. What I can say is that if you look at types, if you look at what individual formulae the script retrieves, we get 34 different noun-adjective pairs that occur at least 20 times. Hainsworth has 38, so there is a lot. There is a loss in recall, and this is mostly due to lemmatization issues. Nows get recognized as nows, and this is not all the time, but sometimes this happens, and this reduces the frequency of formulae with nows, and so on. Okay, so formulae extracted with the script. I then tag them with all the types of transformation that they undergo by hand. One single instance can undergo different transformations, and then transformations are grouped by category based on what traits they affect. So syntax at the level of the clause, syntax of the phrase, morphology, and then for word order, I just tag them as adjective noun versus noun plus adjective. And each formula is also tagged for case and number. This is very boring, but it's to give you an idea. And the important thing here is that I am tagging all types, all things that happen to each adjective noun pair down to case number and word order. So I am not assuming that there is any base form of any of the formulae I'm looking at, which actually Hainsworth does very strongly. For Hainsworth, the base form of a formula is its most minimal form, so with no expansion whatsoever. And this leads to situations in which some formulae never occur in their base form because they always occur with a preposition, for instance. And this is considered expansion, and this, of course, skews the results. What I want to do is be able to assess the overall rate of variation without relying on a preconceived definition of what is the base. So what I need is a statistical measure that will allow me to do so. So compare the rate of variation in the behavior of my target formulae to the rate of variation in the behavior of adjective noun phrases in the baseline corpus. And the measure I have used is entropy, Shannon entropy in information theory. Entropy measures how regularly distributed the states of a system are, so how predictable the system is. The more regularly distributed states are, the less predictable the system is. Because, you know, if you toss a coin, you have two equiprobable, oh, I hate this word, two equally likely outcomes, 50-50. So can you predict which side it will come down on? No. So the entropy of a coin toss is the highest possible. I have used relative entropy, which is the entropy divided by the number of possible states of the system. It's always between 0 and 1. So the entropy of a coin toss would be 1. The entropy of a perfectly ordered system, a coin that is weighted so that it always comes down on one side, will be 0. You can always predict which side it falls on. So if we compare the behavior of a formula to the behavior of constructions in a baseline corpus, we expect the relative entropy of the formula to be lower than the relative entropy of the baseline, because formulae are an ordered system. They are meant to occur in one form overwhelmingly more often. They are like a weighted coin. While the adjective noun pairs in the baseline corpus should occur in a series of forms that, I'm going to say randomly, it's not going to be random. It's just that having several pairs in there means that they will all behave in different ways, and they will be a random sample. They will be so noisy as to behave randomly. Does this make sense? Okay. So what I'm showing you is the relative entropy values for a small sample of formulae. I'm not showing you all 34, compared to the baseline entropy for the baseline corpus. And they are divided by type of modification. I'm going to point at specific things, so don't worry. I've picked 3 formulae. The most frequent one in the formula example, which is nows plus thos, of course, which occurs 104 times. The second to least frequent, which is huios phaidimos. This is just because the least frequent is thealeokolenos, which always occurs in the nominative singular because it's effectively effectively the epithet of the name Here. And then I've chosen allos plus theos, which is a middling frequency one, and it also has allos, which we've isolated as something that does interesting things. And I have highlighted the results in the table which violate the expected pattern, which was entropy of the baseline higher than entropy of the formula. So first of all, the expectation that formulae in general vary less than non-formulaic pairs is absolutely not borne out. A couple of interesting results: word order and separation, which are two parameters in which we would expect formulae to be much more regular, much less flexible due to metrical constraints, actually show higher entropy in 2 out of 3 cases, with the extreme case of allos theos, which actually behaves entirely randomly, 50-50. Other expectation that we had: more frequent formulae are more flexible than less frequent formulae, so higher entropy rates. This is actually upheld as an expectation. There are a couple of exceptions that I have circled in the slide. They have to do with the fact that uios faidimos is very often used with the genitive of the father's name and accompanied by a proper name, so X, the splendid son of someone else. And so this raises the rate for both noun insertion and modification with the genitive. And finally, the behavior of allos plus theos is actually generally more varied, which, as we said, may have to do with the presence of allos. Of course, to actually draw some conclusions about this, I will need to look at other phrases with allos, which I have. I just haven't gotten around to that yet. Notice that the rate of article insertion is still lower than the baseline, which is exactly what we expect, because in Homer, we're still in the very early stages of the development of the article. So that's it for syntax. What conclusions can we draw from this? Well, that patterns of variation are more complex than we expected, that we really want to map the continuum of formulaic flexibility as fully as possible. So in short, do all 34 formulae and place them on some pretty graphs and see if there is a linear development, that correlates to frequency or something like that. And also that we have completely let go of the idea of a base form for each formula, which is neat, but it also makes us question any simple definition of a flexible formula. So what sort of central unit are we looking at within a system of flexible formulae, and how does this unit differ from phraseology in, for instance, non-oral poetry, without even going into prose? Okay, so this was syntax. When it comes to semantics, we are switching our focus a little bit. We have talked about flexibility as it pertains to internal components of the formula, so adjective and nouns that make up a formula. And we've only looked at peripheral elements of the formula in a sort of marginal way. So we have looked at whether expansions were present or not, but not actually what expands these formulae. However, now I want to move on to a second aspect of formulaic flexibility, which also has an effect on formulaic behavior, and that has to do with peripheral elements. And I want to focus on formulae that, because of their syntactic structures, open up or actually require an open slot that needs to be filled with material that is not in itself part of the formula. An example of this is transitive verb phrase formulae, and I've given you an example, the echon and kersin or echon and keri, having in one's hands formula. This requires a direct object. The metrical structure of the core formula is the same in both examples I've given you, and this determines the metrical structure of the open slot, which is stemmata in the first line and toxon in the second line. Stemmat, of course, elided, so it has the same metrical shape, atrochi. But the filler in itself is not part of the formula. Actually, in the second line I've given you, you can see an adjective noun pair. It's palintonatoxa in its quote-unquote base form, in its non-separated form, but it becomes toxon and then gets separated palinton on to fit with the verb phrase formula. And we can also extend complex variations of this original pattern of echein and keri. So in our third example, we have the preposition. The preposition has changed, the tense of the verb has changed, and the metrical structure of the formula has changed. I'm considering all three types together. Why should we look at open slots in formulae? Well, once again, we can have a look at modern language linguistics for justifications for this. Without going too deep into the theory, formulae have been compared to linguistic constructions. In construction grammar, the idea is that a linguistic construction is a unit of form and meaning, which is exactly Paris' definition of the formula, essentially, only with the addition of meter. And the form can be more or less flexible, and the meaning can also be more or less well-defined. In the case of formulae, they will be fairly rigid and fairly well-defined within a traditional context. Why does this matter? Because there is a significant amount of research on what causes a linguistic construction to be more or less productive through time. So which constructions expand and spread out, which constructions fossilize and die out. And research has highlighted the driving role of semantic flexibility in promoting the productivity of formulae. So the range of different meanings that a construction can accommodate in its open slots has an effect on whether it survives or dies out. In particular, the key factor seems to be not quite how widely spread the potential fillers are, but how well they cover a range of semantic areas. So the idea is that constructions that have a limited range of fillers and constructions that have fillers that are very spread out will either die out or will fossilize to one specific, very defined usage. Constructions that have a robust range of fillers that cover a semantic area will tend to extend to new fillers. So new items are more likely to occur in a new construction if the semantic space around the item is densely populated by items that already occur in that construction. This has been a lot of spatial metaphors, coverage, density, space, area. So how do we assess the semantic coverage of a formula, considering that, again, the judgments from native speakers about meaning are entirely unavailable or mostly unavailable. And also we want an operational definition of meaning that will allow us to compare quantitatively a filler such as stemma to a filler such as toxon and figure out how closely related they are. So the answer to this is a linguistic approach to meaning that is called distributional semantics. The key idea in distributional semantics is that the meaning of a word is defined as a function of its collocates in a corpus. So words that share a linguistic context are also related in meaning. And again, it's a definition that is especially useful in corpus studies where you have all possible contexts available. Okay, this is where the maths get a little more annoying, but on the basis of this definition of meaning, what we need to do is encode all the contexts of a word in some mathematical form. This mathematical form is a vector, which encodes, in its dimensions, encodes information about all the words that a specific target word occurs with. And if you take all the vectors for all the words that you're interested in, or all the words in your corpus, you end up with a multidimensional space, which is visualized in 2 dimensions in the figure, and it's really, really hard to read. Great, this figure is from an article that I co-wrote, my fault. But the idea is that in this space, the distance between 2 words, 2 points that are actually vectors, corresponds to the distance in meaning between these 2 words. So words that are closer in the semantic space, they're also closer in meaning, and hopefully you can see at the top left corner of the space, there's 2 words together, na and drachme, that are both units of currency. They're very closely related in meaning. They're like close together. So for the case study that I'm about to talk about, I've built a vector space model that is also built from the diaeresis corpus. In this case, all of it, with no chronological breakdown. So it goes all the way down to the 3rd century AD. No, that's too early. Sorry, the 6th century AD. Different. Okay, so a very preliminary study of the semantic flexibility of verb, noun, phrase formulae. I started from a very small sample, and this is all I'm going to show today. It's 5 phrases. 3 of these phrases are phrases of physical interaction with an object. So phrases involving the word hair, hand, so having something in your hand, picking it up or putting it in one's hand. One phrase of intellectual perception, eoi deinai, knowing well, and one phrase of physical perception, idein ophthalmoisin or ophthalmoisin idestai, seeing with one's eyes. And for each of these phrases, I have manually extracted all of their occurrences from Perseus. Perseus, because of course I want to maintain uniformity of editions with diaresis, and I have isolated and cataloged their fillers. And then I want to look at the semantic behavior of the fillers of all these formulae. And there are different expectations that we can set when looking at how these formulae behave. One of them is that formulae will group based on their meaning. So on one side, you have formulae that of physical interaction, on the other side, you have formulae of intellectual or sensory perception, and we expect two groups. We expect formulae within each group to be similar to each other and to differ from formulae in the other group. Or it could be about diachronic productivity. And in this case, we have two formulae, the hair plus echo one and the idein ophthalmoisi one, that are productive in Hesiod and the hymns. They're well attested in Hesiod and the hymns as well. You have one formula, eoi deinai, that completely dies out after Homer. Keep in mind that these three formulae actually have more or less the same frequency. So this is not about frequency. Actually, they have the same overall frequency. So the ones that occur in Hesiod and the hymns actually occur a bit less in Homer. This should make sense. Yeah. And then we have two other formulae that do occur in the hymns, but respectively once and twice. So they're very rare after Homer, but they're there. So again, we have three groups. One of the three is more or less in the middle between the other two. Third hypothesis, maybe it's about syntax. So eoi deinai is an interesting formula because it takes objects in either the accusative or genitive, with minimal differences in usage that we can talk about. Idein ophthalmoisin, on the opposite end of the spectrum, is entirely inflexible. It only takes objects in the accusative. The order of the words can be swapped, but otherwise that's the one thing you can do, basically. The formulae with hair, they all take objects in the accusative, but they do at least admit some flexibility in whether hair appears with a preposition, without a preposition, with several different prepositions. So again, one big split between two formulae, three formulae that are kind of in between. So what do we do with all this? I know this is scary. I'll explain what this is. So for each formula, I've extracted a measure of the coherence of its fillers. So I have all the fillers for each formula as points in the space. For each formula, I have calculated the centroid of the points that represent its fillers. So it's the geometrical center. And then I measure the distance between each of the fillers and the centroid. This gives me a distribution of distances for each formula. And then we can compare these distributions. And the comparison is visualized in the box plot to the right of the slide, which is basically the one thing you have to look at. In the box plot, the bold line is the mean distance for the fillers of each formula. And the boxes and the dashed lines represent the quantiles of the distribution. And the table on the top left reports the results of a comparison between each pair of formulae, of distributions. And the other parameter that we can consider is the variance of the distribution, which is a measure of how scattered the fillers are among themselves. So distance from the centroid measures how close they are to a geometrical center. Variance measures how close they are between each other. And this is reported in the bottom left table, but it's also visible in the box plot. If you look at how long the dashed lines are, this gives you an approximate measure of the variance. So we had three hypotheses. Our first hypothesis predicted a meaning-based grouping, formulae for physical contact versus formulae for perceptions. For perception, this kind of works. So the distance from the centroid more or less upholds this prediction. Things are a bit clearer for the first of the hand formulae, which is echein and hersin, because it's about twice as frequent than the other two formulae. So results for the other two formulae are less significant because there are fewer of them. One thing that we had gotten wrong is that we expected one group of perception formulae, but actually it turns out that they differ significantly between each other. So there are actually three groups: formulae with hands, formula for knowing, and formula for seeing, instead of two. Second hypothesis, diachronic productivity. Alas, diachronic productivity does not seem to be a particularly good predictor of behavior. It definitely does not correlate with average distance, given that hairs in a cane and ophthalmoids in a destae are on opposite ends of the box plot, the highest average distance and the lowest average distance. It's worth noticing that the one formula that does not continue after Homer, so the Ewe-Denai formula, has an impressively lower variance than all the others, which is marked in the table about variances. So its fillers are not just closer to the centroid, they're also closer to each other. So maybe its semantic flexibility is more limited, and maybe this has influenced its diachronic development. And both of the very productive formulae have significantly higher variance. So this is nice. What is not nice is that variance actually correlates a lot better with syntactic flexibility. So the most flexible formula has the lowest variance, so the more tightly clustered results. And the least flexible formula has the highest variance, the more spread out results. So does semantic coherence promote syntactic flexibility? Do we have, the main problem I have with this result is that I really don't see any reason to connect the two. So why should more semantic flexibility predict less syntactic flexibility, and less semantic flexibility predict more syntactic flexibility? I don't know, I need a bigger sample. In short, like this is limited to 5 formulae. But, and I finally get to conclusions, the semantic analysis is a bit of a mess. So instead of focusing on the results too much, I just want to conclude with some general observations on advantages and limits of this kind of approach. So the first obvious advantage of this sort of quantitative analysis is that it allows us to model formularity as a continuous phenomenon instead of instituting a binary of formulaic versus non-formulaic. However you want to draw this binary, whether you want to draw it between, you know, archaic epic and later epic, if you want to say Homer is formulaic, the hymns are a degeneration of formularity, and also internally within archaic epic, it gives us a way to model a continuum that is not based on frequency. So you don't need to say anything that occurs more than twice is a formula, anything that occurs twice or less is not. You don't need to ask yourself that sort of question. It also allows, as I said, it allows for a more nuanced definition of formula. It also allows for specific parallels with natural language usage, in which phenomena also tend to not fall into two nice, neat bins. On the other hand, it remains difficult to move from a description of formulaic behavior, this works really well, to a predictive model of what causes a formula to change or to adapt in a certain way. And I strongly believe that for reasons of method, we should look for the causes of formulaic behavior by looking at factors that are not directly encoded in the model. So the performance context and the role of orality in shaping what is a natural language of poetry. And to address the role of orality, it's still indispensable to go looking at non-oral traditions, which is something I have done for adjective noun formulae and syntactic variation. And this remains to be done on the side of semantic flexibility. And that's it for me. And thank you for listening. Yes, there we go. Is this what I was meant to do?
Yeah, sure.
I'm doing